Thank you very much, Justin. Inflation, a mortgage time bomb, recession, trade tensions. If you switch on Justin's program in the morning, any time in the past month, you read the newspaper, that's what you're going to hear. It's a pretty gloomy picture out there, and particularly in the UK at the moment. But I do want to convince you of one thing, that it could have been much worse, and we do need to think about some of the upsides that are in the global economy at the moment, and some of this where the sun is poking through the clouds in some ways. And I think it's important just to name them. What's going on? What is a lot better than we thought 2023 would have to hold? Well, the first thing is in Europe in particular, the whole of Europe, including the UK, wholesale gas prices are way down on where they were last year. About 75% down on this time last year, and about 90% down from the peak in August last year. And that means that though we have a cost of living crisis, let's not underestimate it, it's not nearly as bad as it could have been. China has reopened in the winter of last year, and that has improved the global economic outlook. China's not necessarily doing as well as some people hoped, but it's a lot better than 2022. And the other thing that is very clearly different in this year, which is very pertinent to the automotive sector, is the supply chain crisis of 2021 and 2022 has largely disappeared. Goods are traveling across the world in ways that they weren't 2 years ago. So those are the good things about the global economy. Let's have a look at maybe some of the detail here, which isn't quite so cheery. There is slow growth in all of the world economy. If you look at the medium shade blue bar, that's the World Economic Forecast from the OECD just a couple of weeks ago, in the sort of low 3% range. That is low. Look at the lighter bar. That was what the world achieved through the 2010s up to the COVID crisis in 2019. So the world is growing slowly, slightly better than last year, but slowly. You can look at the UK in red there, only a little bit of growth this year, pretty much stagnation. It's better than we thought at the turn of the year, where we thought we'd have a contraction this year, but still not much to write home about. Things get a little bit better in 2024, globally and for the UK. So we shouldn't think about the world just in the right now, where things look really tough, particularly for households. Things are expected to get better. But let's not kid ourselves either. This isn't a huge boom that we're going into. The world is growing quite slowly. Again, next year, slower than the 2010s. A lot of that is coming from China being slower and not entirely replaced by the real success of the Indian economy at the moment, at the top there. So there are, in the world as a whole, I think there's four big stories about the global economy right now. We have on the left there what's going on in China, then on the top right what's going on in the US, then bottom left what's going on in Europe, and finally what's going on in the sort of emerging markets, and particularly some of the poorer nations of the world. Well, the Chinese reopening story, I think a lot of people hoped it would be as good as the Indian reopening story after the Delta wave hit there in April 2021, and then India had a real boom. China's growth is definitively going to be a lot better than last year, where it, for the first time, failed to meet the government's growth targets by quite a long way. The government's growth target for China is about 5% this year. At the moment, most economic forecasters think it will meet it, but it is disappointing, and it's particularly disappointing in the goods trade sector, because growth in China is coming at the moment from consumer services. Now, that is something that the world has asked China to do for decades. Stop just making things and exporting them. Actually make your population better off and have consumer services growth. But what that means is that countries around China who fit into the Chinese supply chain, or the supply chain that includes China, have found that the Chinese reopening hasn't been as encouraging as they hoped. And of course, you've also got, you can see in the red there, this is the Chinese property sector is in quite a lot of trouble, and that's very important in its domestic economy because it underpins government finance and the finance of lots of households. So the fact that house prices are falling and have been falling for some time is potentially a problem. In the US, the problem or the issue is inflation, just like it is in Europe. It's a different sort of inflation. It was driven more by strong demand rather than gas prices. And we've seen a big rise in US interest rates up to 5 to 5.25%. So very similar to the level here. So the question in the US is, when will these drive out inflation? There's quite good signs coming out of the US right now, but getting rid of inflation, the last leg is often the hardest. In Europe, again, quite good news is that the gas price, having been at over 300 euros per megawatt hour last August, very briefly, it's now down to the low 30s, so about 90% off the peak, and that is hugely better. Now, that's still about twice the price that people in Europe normally pay for wholesale gas, so we haven't got rid of the gas crisis, but it does mean that Russia cannot hold Europe to ransom. We have found ways both of conserving gas use and substituting for other forms of energy. And that's a huge success of our economies over the past year, even though it, of course, has been pretty tough. Food prices for the rest of the world was one of the real drags and the thing that was driving poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And they also have come down. They're still relatively high compared with a normal level. So they're still about 20% higher than a normal level, which is roughly when in the sort of mid-2010s was a normal level of food prices. But they also have come down off the peak. So a lot of the key problems have, in some sense, moderated slightly in the past year. So not only have you got those four stories, that's what's going on right now. I think we've got two new themes that are shaping the global economy. One is very pertinent, and it's come driven out of the US, and it's a new industrial policy. The Inflation Reduction Act, misnamed, essentially subsidizes green manufacturing. And you can see by the remarkable chart I've just put up what's happened to, this is investment in manufacturing plants. It's just gone through the roof in the US in the past 6 months or so. So these sorts of subsidies are having a very large effect. It obviously creates trade tensions because in Europe we're all looking over our shoulders and saying, well, if the US is doing that, what are we doing? And does this mean that all of our companies are going to be investing in the US, not elsewhere? And talking about trade, the US, this is, I think, a very, very nice chart. Don't worry about what it says. On the axis are all lots of different industrial sectors. Just look at the green sections of the chart, because it's the share of US trade with other countries. And the green, which are all negative, so that's where the share is falling, that's all US trade with China. So green is US trade with China, falling as a share of total US trade. So you can see that tariffs and what is now called the de-risking strategy of global trade, which is G7, the UK is part of this. We're not allowed to call it decoupling. We're not trying to decouple with China, but we're trying to de-risk our trade, certainly is having quite a big effect. So the other big new theme in the global economy stems from high interest rates, and that is financial vulnerabilities. We saw in March the collapse of a number of US regional banks and Credit Suisse. We saw last October, after the mini-budget, how vulnerable the UK pension system was when interest rates briefly rose very, very rapidly. And this is now a concern across the world because we've got high interest rates for the first time, really, for 15 years. And so if you think about the scheme of what's going on, you have high interest rates at the top there and low interest rates at the bottom, and then the danger of a financial crisis or sort of financial vulnerabilities, they get higher and higher as interest rates go up. And you've also put on the horizontal, if we put where government fiscal policy is, taxes and spending, so lots of borrowing on the right, getting rid of public borrowing on the left, we are probably somewhere like there where I put the dot. When I say we, I mean the UK, I mean all industrial countries. We're in a bit of a danger zone. We've got a lot of borrowing, and that helps keep interest rates high, and that creates financial vulnerabilities. And so pretty much all the international organizations are now saying we should try and get public borrowing down, maybe by raising taxes, because that helps inflation, will help get interest rates lower, and that will also get rid of some of the vulnerabilities that are definitely building up in the financial system. So we probably want to move towards that area, but lots of governments are actually not really doing that and are instead keeping spending more and taxing less, and that is pushing us in maybe that direction. So this is something we need to watch in the weeks and months ahead. How about the UK? Well, we've got a bit of both the US problem, high demand and hitting capacity constraints, labour shortages, and a bit of the European problem of wholesale gas prices and energy crisis last year. So that's what's been really driving, underpinning our economy, and it's pushed inflation up. And because we've got both the US and the European problem, now our inflation rate, though it's coming down and will come down over the summer quite significantly, what's underlying that, core services or core inflation, has been rising. And the key thing was in the last 3 releases of inflation data, it's been very disappointing. Our core inflation is now 7.1%. In the US and the Eurozone is about 5%. And that's why all eyes are really on the UK at the moment. And that's why interest rates are now, they were a month ago at 4.5% with an expectation they might go up to a peak of 4.75%. And then markets took fright after the latest inflation figures, and so did the Bank of England. So we've got interest rates at 5%, and the expectation right now is they'll go up somewhere around 6%. So they've got further to go. I'm sure they have got further to go. Whether they go all the way to 6%, not clear. But as you can see here, almost certainly likely to stay higher for longer. That's difficult in an industry, of course, where you've got a lot of people with consumer finance. It's going to make things tough. And it's doubly tough because the UK economy is not firing on all cylinders. This is the level of our output of the UK economy. And as you can see, essentially from 2020, we've had the huge COVID drop and the recovery from that, but it's flat. We've seen pretty much no growth now since 2020. So that's getting on for 3.5, 4 years. That's not a situation that makes anyone very happy, and not a situation that can continue without some serious problems. What does it mean for the auto industry? Well, again, I think we know there's been a lot of difficulties, particularly supply chain difficulties. So when you look at automotive manufacturing, you can see it has been on a downward trend. There was the COVID bumps there, you can see that, but it's about 30% below the level it was in 2016. I say 2016 just I think I've labelled there the Brexit vote. Has not been a great time, as we unfortunately thought it wouldn't be for the automotive industry, one of the most connected across the EU. We see the pandemic in there, but we are seeing a recovery right at the moment. Now the supply chain problems of last year are easing. So the question is, how much further can that go? But it's almost certainly we've got some recovery in scope, but not necessarily getting back to where we were. And then on the right, you see the servicing, the retailing of motor vehicles. And again, that's been pretty much in the doldrums after falling during the COVID period. Again, that is what's going to be hit by higher interest rates. So just to sum up, we shouldn't slit our wrists at the moment. We shouldn't say it's all terrible, even though the news isn't very good. There are some quite good things going on in the world. We are now getting out of the COVID crisis that hit the world, both for the disease, then the supply chain, and now we've got to beat the inflationary consequences which were kicked off by the COVID crisis. Once we've done that, I think we can look to a better world with more growth. And so that's what we need to focus on. But in the meantime, we've just got to get rid of that inflation, because if we don't, it will get even worse. And we'll have a problem potentially of some financial vulnerabilities which no one wants to get into. Thank you.
I told you, hold fire for a second. I told you he was more cheerful than you might expect, and he has been, so don't slit your wrists. Instead of doing that, why not ask him a question? So there are microphones and indeed people attached to those microphones around. So if anyone has a burning question they want to put to Chris, this is the moment to do it. And while you're thinking what those questions might be, I want to quote to you Mike Hawes, which I can do because they've given me this rather wonderful thing. Well, I say given, I don't think I can get to take it back. But anyway, take it home afterwards. So Mike said right at the beginning, we're in the middle of the most fiercely competitive investment landscape of a generation, et cetera, et cetera. We, he said, are not in the same ballpark as the United States and the European Union when it comes to industrial policy. We need a UK response urgently. Can you see it? Can you see what it looks like, how it might come to fruition?
Well, not at the moment. I mean, we don't see, the government hasn't decided yet what it wants to do. The Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has said that he'll come back with a plan and a strategy in the autumn statement later in October or November. We do have to recognise two things, I think, in the UK. One is that we are in a competitive landscape, and like it or not, and lots of people wouldn't like it, wouldn't say it's the ideal thing for governments to be involved, sort of competing with each other's over subsidies, but given that's there almost certainly has to be some UK response. But equally, we're not the US, we're not the EU, we're much smaller than that, so we have to think where we target it. And that, otherwise, if we just spread the money that we could realistically put in this area from government, it would be spread so thinly if it went everywhere. So for your industry, you need to persuade government that your industry is the place it should go.
Right. Anyone with a question? Yes, gentleman at the front here. So hold on just a second. We'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, here we go.
Question about energy pricing and the gas price halving. Can you explain why the electricity's price is still 3 times higher than historical data, where the gas price is twice as high as it was? There's still a huge offset in there, which I don't really understand.
Yeah, so part of it is lags. So it's just that there's a delay. So we've had this big fall in energy prices. Energy prices didn't rise immediately when the wholesale price went up, and they'll take a while to come down. Then for industry, there's a whole structure. So lots of people are on fixed tariffs at different levels. And so again, that builds further lags into the system. But I would have thought if we don't see big reductions in electricity prices in the near future, given what's happened to gas prices and given that the UK is heavily dependent on gas for its electricity generation still, more so than many other countries, then we've got something not quite working in our electricity market. So that is something to keep an eye on.
Okay, a couple of questions here, if I can bring the microphone down. Yeah, gentleman here, and then across in the corner there.
Chris, I mean, rising interest rates are traditionally a good way of suppressing demand, but given the large part of inflation now is from the supply side, do you really think that interest rates can solve inflation?
Yes, because it's always a balance between demand and supply. So even if supplies caused this inflation, you've still got excess demand. So you still need to bash down on demand to get rid of it. That's what's brutal and ugly about monetary policy. What's really difficult this time round is that we're seeing the sort of arbitrary nature, both of inflation, who it's hit and who it's not hit, and interest rates, because it hits a small segment of the population. Less than 30% of households have a mortgage. Lots of them don't have a large mortgage, but if you've recently taken one out in the last 4 or 5 years, you'll be hit far harder than the rest of the population. And that is why you're hearing all the time now from the IMF, OECD, all these international organizations saying, hang on, what governments have a role here too. You could redistribute, so it's not just hitting the people who have got very large mortgages the hardest, or you could generally raise taxes to take demand out of the system that way and have it in a way that's slightly fairer than whoever happened to fix in 2019 on a 5-year rate.
Gentleman here, and then we've got one, probably room full. Yes, if you could pass it along. Thank you. Just keep going. Here we go.
Thanks, Justin. John Neal, Chairman of Unipart Group. Chris, always great to hear your balanced view of the situation. But the Americans have just changed the rules on the free enterprise system. You know, some say it's 10 trillion that's going to be deployed against the industries of the future. And the UK hasn't got a lot of money. So what do you think we can and should do to stay competitive?
I think what we have to look at is what we're good at. And then that's where we need to put money, but also the resources of time and effort and building on that. There's no point in trying to compete with exactly what America's going to do. And America won't necessarily be able to fund that. They've got their own planning problems. They've got their own fiscal problems. Their budget deficit is really going to start causing a problem for the US soon. So I think we shouldn't, again, get into a situation we just say, oh, it's disastrous, we can't manufacture anywhere outside China or the US. But we do need to think hard about what we're best at and then just stick to our knitting.
Right. Last one, there was someone over there with a, yes, gentleman right at the front with a chair.
Thank you. Dave Kennan, ZT Finance. I enjoyed your presentation very much, thank you. With interest rates still rising, are we going to avoid, and of course all the banks that went down in America in March, are we going to avoid a banking crisis?
In the UK, I think we are going to avoid a banking crisis. Our banks are far, far safer than they were in 2007-8. I mean, but total order of magnitude safer. So you would have to have the sort of the mother of all housing crashes, which created the mother of all repossession crisis. So we would have an enormous crisis before our banks were under any particular pressure. In the US, I think the jury's still out on whether we've seen the last of the regional banks going under. There is a lot of commercial real estate loans which are probably underwater. Now, the question is, can we string that out for enough time such that the banks get through it, in which case then it's okay, and the US has to think quite hard about its regulatory system on its banks, because its big banks are fine because they're properly regulated, but its smaller ones weren't. But here in the UK, I think at the moment, that's not the thing that we need to worry about.
Chris, on that note, we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. Thank you so much again. Round of applause, please, to Chris Giles from the FT.